It was the late morning of Wednesday, the 3rd of February 1937, and behind the high walls of Manchester's Strangeways Jail, two men sat in adjacent condemned cells, closely guarded by death watch officers as the clock counted down their last day on earth. Preparations were well underway for the planned double execution, and the chief hangman and his three assistants were already making their way north to the grim Victorian prison. Both men had been convicted at the same Manchester Assizes in December 1936, and it was decided that for convenience and to save the hangman making two visits to the jail, they would be hanged side by side. In the first condemned cell, George Royal, a 26-year-old electrician and petty criminal from Stockport, had become buoyed up during the last week when a black cat had strayed into the prison grounds and formed an attachment with him when he was on exercise. Believing it to be a sign of good luck, Royal had finally come out of the massive depression that had left him barely able to get out of bed since conviction. His crime had made newspaper headlines across the country, with large crowds clamouring to view proceedings when Royal appeared in court where details of his crime were revealed. Shortly after 10 o'clock on the morning of Thursday, the 8th of October 1936, a railway worker walking his dog near the Greyhound Inn on the East Lancs Road, Lee, Lancashire, in the northwest of England, noticed something lying close to a fence beside the road. Going to investigate, he found himself looking down upon the body of a woman covered in a blue raincoat. He flagged down a passing lorry, and after a driver confirmed the sighting, they hurried to call the police. A post-mortem carried out by Manchester pathologist Dr. Arnold Renshaw found that cause of death was asphyxiation from a blue and white scarf removed from around her neck. Besides marks from the scarf, which had been tied in a reef knot, there was also the deep impression of a necklace the victim had been wearing. Renshaw told detectives that it looked like foul play, and when a murder inquiry was set up, the identity of the woman was quickly ascertained as Mary Josephine Holden, a 34-year-old Manchester prostitute who worked under the name of Ethel Jones. Witnesses came forward with a host of clues. Mary had left her lodgings on the previous Tuesday evening. She had been drinking in a Manchester public house in the company of a man named Bill Hobson. Hobson said he had accompanied her to Victoria Station, where she had purchased a train ticket to Oldham. He said they had parted at about 10:30 p.m. A few hours later, a green saloon car was spotted speeding away from Manchester city centre. The door was half open and a woman was hanging out, shouting and screaming, "Stop, let me get out." The witness was able to tell detectives the vehicle registration number, and a check on this found that the car had been reported stolen earlier that Tuesday evening. A police officer spotted the car with the matching registration number being driven through Peterborough on Friday morning, and Royal was placed under arrest. "I had no intention of harming her, only to keep her quiet," Royal admitted when he appeared at Lee Police Court. George Royal stood trial for his life at Manchester Assizes on Monday the 7th of December, just 2 months later. The court heard that Royal had picked Ethel Jones up in Manchester city centre, and once she got into the car she asked for money. He offered her 10 shillings, and she told him that for 10 shillings more he could spend the night with her. Royal said he only had 16 shillings, and at that she got angry and began shouting at him. To pacify her, Royal gave her 10 shillings and agreed at her request to drive her towards Liverpool. As they headed out of the city, he then changed his mind and said as the car was stolen, he couldn't drive to Liverpool in case they were stopped by the police. Royal now said he would drop her off on the East Lancs Road where she could continue her journey. But as they drove, she began hurling insults and started to yell at him that she wanted to get out of the car. Trying to calm her down, he pulled at her scarf and she slumped forward. As he drove further down the road, he realised she had not stirred. Thinking she had just fainted, Royal said he dragged her out of the car, laid her by the side of the road behind a bush and covered her with a coat so she wouldn't catch cold. Royal said that he only learned of her death when he was informed by a police officer on the train back from Peterborough to Manchester. Despite denying he committed murder, the crux of the case, that she had died as a result of his actions, was not in dispute. Summing up, Mr Justice Lawrence asked a jury of 10 men and 2 women if they believed the prisoner's evidence or his statement. Have you any reasonable doubt that he tied that scarf? If you have, then you will find him not guilty of murder. Once they had considered their verdict, the jury returned to find Royal guilty as charged, and when asked if he had anything to say before sentence of death was passed, his mother began to scream in the public gallery. Once Royal had been removed from court, his mother asked the judge for permission to speak to her son, and seeing her, Royal rushed forward in tears begging, "Mother, please help me." Following conviction, the jury then heard that Royal had a long criminal record and had attacked a woman just a few weeks before he committed the murder. His mother immediately set up a campaign collecting signatures and petitioning for a reprieve. In the adjacent condemned cell, the prisoner here was less optimistic to his fate. Unlike Royal, there had been little effort to secure a reprieve on his behalf, with many believing the cold-blooded murder he had been convicted of was worthy of the ultimate penalty. Max Mayer Haslam was not the sort of person who blended into a crowd. Bow-legged and standing a little over 4'6" tall, at 23 years old, he was known in the pubs and boarding houses around Nelson in the northwest of England as the Dwarf. On Monday the 22nd of June 1936, a man walked into Nelson police station and made a statement to the effect that a dwarf was hawking jewellery around the local pubs. Two things that caused the honest citizen to suspect that this was something worthy of police investigation were the fact that the goods were of such high quality they were almost certainly stolen, and that he had overheard the man say he had killed a dog while obtaining the jewellery. Detectives decided to check out the story and made routine investigations by visiting a number of pawn shops. They soon gathered up a number of objects identified as being sold by a dwarf, items which he clearly did not appreciate the true value of, as he only received a fraction of their worth. As inquiries intensified, police suspected that they may know the origin of the jewellery. Living at 56 Clayton Street, Nelson, was a 70-year-old spinster, Ruth Clarkson, who shared the tiny terraced house with her pet fox terrier dog Roy. Outwardly poor, with a house that perfectly fitted the picture of 1930s depression, this appearance of poverty may have been accepted to the majority of local citizens, but one or two neighbours knew that all was not it appeared to be at Clayton Street. Despite her ragged appearance and squalid existence, Ruth Clarkson was a wealthy woman, owning a number of houses in the town as well as a large amount of expensive Victorian jewellery. Led by Superintendent Lineker, detectives called at Clayton Street and knocked on the door at number 56. There was no answer. The repeated knocking alerted the attention of the next door neighbour. She mentioned that she hadn't seen or heard anything from Ruth Clarkson for several days, but more importantly, she hadn't heard the high-pitched yelp of the dog, and which, by rights, should now have been barking with the officers banging on her door. Detectives checked round the back and found that the window showed signs of being forced, but from the condition of the door and window frames, they couldn't tell if the markings were old or recent. The neighbour told police that Ruth's niece lived nearby, and she was quickly summoned to the house and admitted the officers. The sight that greeted them was horrendous. The house was in a dreadful state. Emptied food tins, old newspapers and dirty bottles and plates were everywhere. Mice scurried around gnawing at scraps of food left on the kitchen table, and lying on the floor, dressed in what resembled rags, was the battered body of Ruth Clarkson. She was clearly dead. The numerous gashes on her head and upper body bore testimony to a fearful beating she had clearly received. The murder weapon was almost certainly the blood-stained tile lever that lay beside the body. There was blood everywhere, pools on the floor and streaks on the walls and ceiling. The horror didn't end there. Upstairs in the bedroom, detectives were appalled to find the battered body of the pet dog suspended from the metal headboard. Later that day, a post-mortem was carried out by pathologist Dr. Renshaw, who recorded the cause of death due to head injuries, 17 in total, any one of which would have been fatal. The victim had a fractured skull, cheekbone and wrists, which suggested she had desperately tried to fight off the assailants. It was also found that the dog had died as a result of being strung up by a rope around its neck after receiving a fearful kicking, as it probably fought bravely to prevent its mistress being attacked. The arrest of Max Haslam took place less than an hour after discovery of the body. His easily identifiable figure was spotted wandering along nearby Pendle Street, and as darkness began to fall, he was taken into custody. He made no attempt to resist arrest but denied any knowledge of the murder of Miss Clarkson. He had in his possession items of jewellery which he was asked to explain. Brazenly he said they were his own property. Interviewed by Superintendent Lineker, it was soon discovered that Haslam had recently been released from serving a 12-month term at Liverpool's Walton Jail for theft. Satisfied they had their man, Haslam was charged with murder and remanded in custody. With Haslam detained, an investigation into his background revealed an interesting story. Born in Haywood just before the First World War into a large family, a crippling bone disease had left him unable to walk until he was 9 years old, and by the time he reached his 20s, his growth had been stunted and he was severely bow-legged. This disability caused him to become a surly loner, and he had struggled at school. He found work in the cotton mills, but when made redundant in the economic decline of the mid-30s, he turned to a life of crime. After several convictions for robbery, he served a number of prison terms before being released from his last stretch just a month before he was arrested for murder. Max Mayer Haslam's trial took place on Tuesday the 8th of December 1936, a day after George Royals, at the same Manchester Assizes and before the same Mr Justice Lawrence. He pleaded not guilty. Mr Joseph Cooksey Jackson led for the Crown, while Mr Edward G. Hemmerd took charge of the defence. Evidence was shown that upon his release from jail, Haslam had moved to Nelson, where he found lodgings on Vernon Street. Here he became friendly with two unemployed labourers, 69-year-old James Davidson, who Haslam had previously met in Walton Jail, and Thomas Barlow. The three men spent their days moping around Nelson town centre, on the lookout for and plotting ways to make some easy and quick money. On Saturday the 13th of June, Haslam's 23rd birthday, the three men went to the Labour Exchange, and then later, as they were walking along Scotland Road, they spotted Miss Clarkson out walking her dog. Barlow spat. "Look at that dirty old bugger. Can you believe she has more money than the lot of us?" When Haslam asked how he knew that, Barlow replied that he once lived back to back with her. "How does that prove she is rich?" Davidson remarked, as they watched her disappear down the road. "Trust me," Barlow smiled. On Friday the 19th of June, the men met up again in a town centre cafe. Haslam was grumbling that he was about to be evicted from his lodgings as he was struggling to find the rent money. He told his friends he was going to have a walk around the market. When they made to accompany him, he said that he was going alone and let them finish their tea. No sooner had Haslam left the cafe, the two men followed him outside and watched him head towards the market. Keeping a discreet distance, they saw Haslam skirt around and head towards Clayton Street. They saw him stop outside the front door of number 56 before they decided to keep out of sight and headed back to the market. The three men met up later that evening in the Lord Nelson Hotel, and when asked if he had any luck on the market, Haslam replied that he had not. Haslam didn't stay at his lodgings that night, but returned early next morning. His friends noticed he seemed excited, and it was soon clear he was in possession of more money than he had been on the previous day. Later he made a startling confession that he had killed a dog during a robbery, and as he made more revelations during the day, it soon became clear that in all probability Haslam had returned to Clayton Street on the previous night and carried out the attack. The two friends then decided to report their suspicions to the police, unaware that by this time Haslam was already under arrest. The defence at the trial suggested that the two friends were responsible for the crime, and they had concocted an alibi for the purpose of framing their erstwhile colleague. However, Haslam's fingerprints had been found on a chair in the house, and there was also traces of blood, the same group as the old lady's, and also dog hairs identical to the terrier found on Haslam's boots. The prosecution called a witness who testified that the tyre lever found at the scene of the crime was identical to one he had sold to Haslam 2 days before the murder. Another witness claimed he saw Haslam drop an item down a drain. Police lifted the grid and found a watch case that belonged to Miss Clarkson. In the face of a wealth of evidence, including Haslam's weak alibi that he was at a cricket match when the crime was committed, the 3-day trial ended in the only possible verdict, the jury deliberating for just less than 1 hour. "Thank you, my lord," Haslam said before sentence of death was passed on him. His appeal in January was dismissed, and Haslam was returned to the condemned cell at Strangeways Jail to await execution. At lunchtime, on Wednesday, the 3rd of February 1937, Louis Ball, the governor of Manchester Prison, visited George Royal in his cell. In his hand he held a letter. "You are to be reprieved," he told the shocked prisoner. Clearly stunned at this last-minute stay of execution, Royal asked the governor to repeat the news. Then, as realisation set in that his life had been spared, Royal asked about the man in the cell next door. The governor slowly shook his head and departed. A telegram had also been sent to Royal's mother, and she was granted a visit with her son that same afternoon. Discussing the prisoner for whom the hangmen were now preparing the drop at the end of B Wing, Royal told her, "Pray for him, mother. God knows I pity him. Tonight I shall pray for him like I have never prayed in my life." Royal was removed from the death cell to the hospital before being moved into the main prison wing, prior to being sent to a different jail to serve his life sentence. With no hope in sight, Haslam was asked to authorise the disposal of all his worldly goods following his execution, which he signed in the presence of the 2 guards watching over him. At 9 o'clock on the following morning, Max Mayer Haslam walked to the scaffold. Uncle and nephew, Tom and Albert Pierpoint, carried out the execution. Pierpoint Jr. later noted that working out the drop for the prisoner wasn't as straightforward as normal due to the abnormal muscular development. They worked out a precise drop of 8'6" and 3/4 inches. Outside the prison, as 9 o'clock approached, the Rolls Royce of wealthy abolitionist Mrs. Violet van der Els drove towards the barriers that police had put up to stop protesters reaching the prison gate. She was prevented from going forward, but as the fatal hour struck, her supporters removed their hats and caps and began to sing "Abide With Me." Haslam's brother waited outside the prison in tears for a notice of execution to be posted, telling a reporter that his father had refused to see the condemned man while awaiting execution and had said that if the authorities hadn't have hanged him, he would have done it himself. Later that morning, Max Haslam, his body now the property of the state, was buried in the felons' graveyard inside the walls of Strangeways Jail, where it was to remain for 54 years before being exhumed following rebuilding work at the prison in 1991 following the riots. The bodies of 63 executed murderers, of which 45 are identifiable, were cremated at Blakely Crematorium and the ashes interred in the adjacent cemetery. George Royal served the majority of his sentence at HMP Wakefield in Yorkshire till he was released on licence on the 21st of November 1945, having served just less than 9 years. He was soon to return to a life of crime over the next decade and was jailed several times for shopbreaking and larceny. In June 1956, he was sentenced to 10 years after being arrested again for larceny. Following his arrest, he told officers that he had strong sexual impulses which he could not curb, adding, "I am afraid if I am allowed out, I will strangle some woman again." In the early 1960s, Royal was released again from prison, and following a marriage in December 1963, he and his wife settled in a house in Eton, Mersey, Stockport. In the following year, they both found jobs, his wife in the offices and Royal as a handyman at Butlins holiday camp at the Bethely in North Wales, presumably keeping his murderous past a secret from his new employers. My name is Steve Fielding. Thank you for watching and listening to this episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. If you have enjoyed the video, please press like, and if you don't already, can I ask you to subscribe? Your support keeps the channel on the air. Please check out my website, stevefielding.com, where you can find information on all my current and previous books, and also order copies of the 3-volume hardback series, The Hangman's Record 1868 to 1964. Available now on Amazon are the first 2 volumes in the Tales from the Hangman's Record series. These feature the transcripts from cases from the YouTube channel along with extra photographs not used in the videos. These are available as both paperback books and Kindle downloads. Look out for my podcast channel, Tales from the Hangman's Record, and also Mostly Murder, which will feature cases not covered by the scope of the Hangman's Record. Do you agree with the verdict in this case? Please use the comments below for your thoughts and also for suggestions for other cases to be featured in the Tales from the Hangman's Record series.